And welcome everyone to August Tenant Talk Live. For those that may or may not have seen the e-blast, today's theme is the federal budget and appropriations explained by our lovely Kim Johnson, who I will introduce in a short while. But for those who are joining Tenant Talk Live today for the first time, my name is Sid, and I am Manager of Inclusive Community Engagement at NLIHC. And again, you're currently joining Tenant Talk Live, where we provide opportunities for tenants and residents across the country to connect with one another. We share best practices and we learn how to be involved in federal housing advocacy, as well as leading within your communities. So we're thrilled to have Kim join us today, but before I invite her on, I'll just share our usual updates. And again, starting off with our community agreements, which I will share on the screen right now. Right, so just sharing our community agreements. So rule for myself, just a reminder for everyone that this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards. And then the first rule, just platinum rule, treating others the way they want to be treated. So in other words, consider how others want to be treated and how that might differ from how you want to be treated. This rule differs from others because it rejects the idea that reciprocity is the norm and favors empathy and grace instead. And it encourages folks to build connections and understand each other's preferences. Number two is we show respect to others by being considerate of our interactions and accountable for our actions. We listen actively with an open mind and empathy, and we listen with intent to learn something of value from those who are sharing, and we are as attentive to and as present with each other as possible. And then number four, final one, is we take up space and remember to give space to others to ensure everyone feels empowered to contribute to the conversation. And this includes muting your mic when others are speaking. So that's our community agreements. And again, if you have any feedback or want to add anything to that, feel free to email me directly. And you can also view the community agreements at the link I'm going to share in the chat. Awesome. And then we'll also be sending out like follow-up materials in our weekly connection e-blast that goes out every Friday. So you should be expecting one this upcoming Friday, August 8th in the afternoon. If you're not signed up for NLIHC emails, you might miss it, but I'll put the link again in the chat for you to sign up for those. And those e-blasts are really important if you want to catch any recap materials like the recording, the chat, and any other links that were shared in the chat as well. And then some logistics. So again, just make sure to use the chat if you have any questions throughout the call, and we'll make sure to go through that, as well as anybody else who raises their hand to ask questions out loud. And then again, we just ask that you stay muted if you're not speaking. And then if you're not able to get to the mute button in time, we'll make sure to get it on our end. And before we get started, we will be starting off today's call as we have this year by giving some time to everyone to connect and, break the ice and kind of build community a little bit more. We'll be doing that for about 10 minutes. So I'll start the breakout rooms in a second and you'll have 10 minutes in there, like I said. But this month's question is, what is one summer activity you hope to do before the summer is over? So I'll put that in the chat for you all real quickly. And then let me put you into your breakout rooms real fast. And you will have, let's see. You will have about, you will have about 10 minutes in there. So we'll see you soon. Well, awesome. Thank you again for coming back, everybody. But if there's one or two people that wants to share some of the activities that they want to get to before the end of the summer, you can drop it in the chat as well.
Oh, can I share?
Yeah, of course.
Well, I mean, I kind of checked off everything on my summer bucket list. So two of my goals was to run a 10K. So I did that, the Peachtree Road Race in Atlanta. And then also, to see Beyonce, which I did. Shout out Beyonce. That was like the best concert I've ever been to. So yeah.
Yeah. What night did you go to?
I went to Atlanta night 3.
Me too. Oh my
Oh,
God.
for real? Hey, yeah, we were spoiled. We had Jay-Z, so shout out him. Yeah.
It was so worth it. Um, yeah, and congrats on the 10K. Is there anyone else that wants to go before we get started? No.
Yes, yes,
Oh, it's Talisa.
yes, the National Action Network with Reverend Sharpton is going to have a march on Wall Street on August 28th. People from around the country is coming. We're going to march where the money's at. Look, they can send 4 billion to Israel and cut the HUD budget by 1 billion. We got problems. We got issues. Don't tell me we ain't got no money. We got the money, but we got to tell them where to put it. So if you're over here, you're more than welcome to join. If not, get online, tell people about it that you know on the East Coast. Get their butts over to Wall Street on August 28th. All
Yeah.
right. Check out the National Action Network website.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'll see if I can look that up and put that in the follow-up too, Talisa. Thank you.
Yes, we got to get that money where it needs to be. 100, I think 989 million they cut from the HUD budget. And
Yeah. And
that's
we're gonna talk about it today too. We actually have a really good expert that'll break it down for us. Um, but thank you again, Talisa. I'll put it in the chat. I'll try to find it while Kim's presenting.
yes.
But
One
um,
thing I've learned over the years, don't let them tell you they ain't got no money. No, we got money. You need to move at least 1 billion from that 4 million we give every year to Israel. And they're not listening to us and they're not doing right over there. So we can snatch a billion back.
exactly, we're gonna take our money back for housing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But thank you again, everybody, for sharing. And I hope you're all having a good summer so far, despite all of the troubles and barriers I feel like we're facing right now. But I appreciate y'all for sharing. And we'll keep it moving. I'm gonna introduce our Senior Director of Policy, who will be speaking with us today and sharing some of her lovely knowledge on the federal budget, but her name is Kim Johnson. And for folks who haven't had a chance to meet Kim before, she is lovely and she is also an expert on all things policy, but her specialty really lies in federal policy, the budget, regulatory stuff. So she knows what she's talking about. So I'm glad to hand it over to her to talk about appropriations and all of the stuff.
Thank you, Sid, and thank you everyone for having me. Like Sid said, I'm Kim Johnson. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm the Senior Director of Policy here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And like Talisa said on the outset, don't let people tell you we don't have the money to afford to feed, clothe, and house everybody, because we do. It just is a matter of where the federal government is choosing to spend it. But let's jump on in to a little overview of what in the heck is going on federally. God, if I know. But let's see if we can provide some clarity and some updates too. So, boop. So Sid asked me to join today to provide a little bit of an Appropriations 101 and some updates on the federal budget and spending process. Like I said, I'm Kim Johnson. There's my contact information. Folks can please feel free to reach out with any questions, but also I'll have a little trouble seeing any questions or Q&A while I'm presenting. So Sid, please feel free to interrupt me if a question comes in that you feel like should be asked. Otherwise, I am going to try to leave enough time at the end to get to some ample Q&A. So let's jump in and waste no more time. That's me again. Anyway. Oh. All right, so we're going to start off with just a quick little table setting on the difference between appropriations and reconciliation. Those are two processes that have been in the news a lot lately that are easily confused because they're both confusing. So let's add a little bit of clarity before we do a little bit of a deeper dive into the federal appropriations process. Take a look at where things are now and the outlook ahead for HUD funding in FY26. So to talk a little bit about appropriations and reconciliation, often confused because they are both confusing and tedious and both rooted in the federal budget process, but they are two separate beasts all on their own. So let's talk a little bit about what each one does. So appropriations is the yearly process that Congress does every year to fund the federal government. A new fiscal year begins on October 1st. So for example, we are currently in fiscal year 2025, and we are fighting for more funding in fiscal year 2026, which will begin on October 1st of this year and last until September 30th of next year. Now, that appropriations process includes the process for funding HUD programs, and that is in the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, or THUD or THUD spending bill, depending on whatever lingo you prefer. And it's important to note that a new spending bill cannot be enacted with fewer than 60 yes votes in the Senate. And so that means an appropriations bill is going to require bipartisan support in order to be enacted. Now, reconciliation is a special legislative procedure that's not usually used, but it is becoming increasingly common. And there are certain limits to the kind of provisions that can be included in a reconciliation package. So, for example, it cannot target HUD funding, which is why we did not see HUD programs brought up in the whole reconciliation bill that we just saw enacted. Reconciliation is powerful, though, because it allows a bill to pass with just 51 votes in the Senate. And so that means if a single party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House, a bill can be enacted through reconciliation without any bipartisan support at all. And we just saw that happen, of course, with the HR 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which that's the only time I'm going to say it. But that is a bill that just passed through that reconciliation process. So using the might of Republicans alone in the House, the Senate, and the White House, they passed that bill. So let's jump a little bit into appropriations instead of reconciliation, because of course, like I said, reconciliation is its own beast. It deserves its own call. So let's spend some time now talking a little bit about that very, very important annual appropriations process. So appropriations really only kind of makes up a smaller percent of the federal budget. About what's that? 26% of the federal budget is actually appropriated funding. And then it's an even smaller little percentage that is not what's called non-defense discretionary spending. So that's just everything that's not defense or on the mandatory side of the spending aisle, which we see in this chart is represented from the blue shaded stuff. That's mandatory spending, and that includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, the Affordable Care Act, and other mandatory programs. Those programs can be targeted through reconciliation. And that's why we saw those included in that bill that just passed. For appropriated funding, we have these two big buckets called non-defense discretionary and defense discretionary. And so that is just defense and non-defense spending. And then when we look at a little bit deeper into that non-defense spending category, we see that it supports a lot of critical activities. So that includes stuff around, I believe the Center on Budget ties housing and homelessness services into this big economic security and social services bucket. But it's also paying for things around, criminal legal system, general government functions, public health and medical research, education, international affairs, science, space, environment, everything else really, other than the other pieces that we just mentioned explicitly. So when we're talking about the HUD budget, we're talking about a pretty teeny sliver of the overall federal spending pie. Some key dates to cover in the federal appropriations process. And this is how things are supposed to run. I do want to include the disclaimer that Congress has not finished its appropriations work on time since I think 1994 or since the 90s. So this is not in any way a binding or a mandated, well, it is technically, it is technically a mandated timeline, but Congress more often than not, blows past it and kind of keeps things moving through a series of other processes like a continuing resolution. But anyway, so what's supposed to happen is that in early February, the president is supposed to release a budget request for the coming fiscal year. It's important to note that the president's budget request is not in any way binding. It is more of a kind of statement about the president's priorities going forward. It's more of a messaging bill than anything. And that is, of course, good news when we look at the president's budget request from this past for FY26, because it proposed some pretty devastating changes and cuts to HUD funding and changes to HUD programs. We're not going to dwell on that because none of those proposals actually came forward into the House or Senate draft budgets. But just know that that president's budget request is something that they do every year and is not binding to because only Congress has the power to actually appropriate funding. In April, Congress is supposed to pass a budget resolution. Again, they usually don't. It's a little bit bananas how often Congress says, yeah, this is what we're supposed to do, and then they kind of just go on and do it anyway. So for example, they have not passed a budget resolution for FY26, but that has not stopped them from moving forward on the FY26 process. And that budget resolution is basically supposed to provide a really top line outline of like, okay, this is the money that you're going to be working with appropriators. This is the money that's coming in. This is the money that's going out. And these are kind of the top line allocations for spending that you have to play with. And those are called 302A allocations. And that's for the defense and the non-defense kind of spending programs, those two yellowish orange like pots of money we were looking at. And this is also kind of where the piece of reconciliation intersects. So this is also where if Congress wanted to do another budget reconciliation bill, they would write instructions in this budget committee on this budget resolution, but that's neither here nor there. All you need to know is usually Congress is supposed to pass this budget resolution. Usually they don't, they just jump on in with the appropriations process instead. And so from May to September, the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees are drafting their appropriations bills and voting on their appropriations bills and trying to get them enacted through the House and the Senate before that October 1st deadline. And so they need to do 12 bills. Each bill gets its own kind of top line spending, which is where you hear the term 302B allocation. If you've ever heard me reference on a call or something else or seen in one of our newsletters, NLIHC's 302B letter, that's what that's referencing, is it's asking for as much money as possible for that transportation, housing, and urban development bill. And so these are the 12 bills that Congress is kind of trying to fund every year. The big one, of course, for housing is the THUD bill, but we also get funding in things, or we also pay attention to things like the agriculture bill because it has funding for rural development. We pay attention to the Homeland Security bill because it has funding for FEMA. And what's the other one? Oh, Labor HHS also has some additional funding for programs like the low-income heating and energy assistance program, or LIHEAP. So all of those different bills have different pieces of the puzzle when it comes to kind of forming that broader safety net.
Yeah, everybody's okay.
So when it comes to the actual process of appropriations, the House and Senate move along parallel tracks. So at the same time, their subcommittees are drafting their upcoming spending bills. The full committee is also, looking at is taking those spending bills to look at them. Both of them are kind of moving through these processes. So ultimately, we end up with two different bills, one that comes out of the House and one that comes out of the Senate. And those two bills need to be reconciled in a process known as conferencing, where they basically meet and say, okay, the House bill looks like this, the Senate bill looks like this. How do we close the gap between those two to come to a final agreement on a final spending bill? And so they go through that process of conferencing. They come to a resolution on a final bill. The House votes on that final bill. The Senate votes on the final bill, and then they are sent to the president to be signed into law. And that is how the appropriations process should work. Of course, that is not how it usually works or how it has worked, again, for a couple decades now. So Congress has not managed to pass a spending bill on time for a while. They are supposed to pass it by October 1st, but if they do not, they need to pass what's known as a continuing resolution, or the government it partially shuts down. And so we saw that a few years ago during the first Trump administration. I think the historic 36-day shutdown was over Congress's inability to pass a spending bill or a continuing resolution to continue funding the government. So a continuing resolution maintains funding for federal programs for a specified period of time. And because the cost of housing and rental assistance and homelessness programs increase every year, that means we need to see increased funding every year from the federal government for HUD programs in order to just maintain the number of services and the number of households being helped. And so that means a continuing resolution, because it provides flat funding, essentially acts as a cut, and fewer people ultimately get served if it's a if we're under a long-term continuing resolution. This past fiscal year, Congress actually did not manage to finish their appropriations work, and so we have been operating under a year-long continuing resolution that passed back in March. So they were 5 months late in not doing their work appropriately. And so we did manage to get additional funding for certain programs, which are known as anomalies, which essentially help offset the harm that a continuing resolution would do. So because we needed increased funding for programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program in order to make sure people didn't lose their assistance, we ended up getting this pocket of increased funding above what would be provided in a normal continuing resolution in order to help offset the impact of that funding, of that flat funding. So where are we now? We are right now, both the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees have released and voted through their draft FY26 spending bills. Congress is currently in recess, so they are not going to be able to consider those spending bills until they get back in September. And again, they will still need to go through the conferencing process and figure out all of the other kind of differences between what is being proposed, all before October 1st. So that does not leave them a lot of time. So some of the quick top line takeaways for where we are now in this appropriations process, like someone said at the top of the call, oh shoot, sorry, got a little happy on my keyboard there. So like was said at the top of the call, the House fiscal year bill recommends cutting about almost $1 billion from HUD's budget. From the previous year. The Senate bill would increase funding for HUD by about $3.3 billion, which obviously is much, much better than the House's bill. Importantly, both of those spending bills are a clear rejection of the drastic cuts and the programmatic overhauls that were proposed by the Trump administration. We have a budget chart that I should have left for Sid to drop in the chat, but I forgot to. But it compares the funding levels between some key HUD programs in the president's budget request, the House's draft budget, and the Senate budget as well. So the House budget proposes some pretty drastic cuts to some programs, including zeroing out the Home Investment Partnership Program, which helps provide gap financing for the development of affordable housing, among other uses. It also slashes funding for fair housing and eliminates the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which helps coordinate the federal response to homelessness across federal agencies. The House also proposed some pretty harmful changes that would be used to increase work requirements or time limits on HUD-assisted households. It would also limit funding for sanctuary cities, which of course are local communities who don't have a cooperative agreement or do not cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement. And this House bill would also revoke a 30-day eviction notice on HUD-assisted properties. So that mandates that owners and owners and operators of HUD-assisted housing provide tenants with at least 30 days notice before filing an eviction. And importantly, neither of these spending bills provide sufficient funding to continue the emergency housing voucher program. And neither bill provides full funding to ensure the full renewal of all housing choice vouchers. So just to speak a little bit to the emergency housing voucher funding program, and then I'm going to wrap it up soon so that Sid can get to your questions. The emergency housing voucher program was enacted in 2021, actually through budget reconciliation, but Democrats controlled the House, Senate, and the White House at the time. And so they provided $5 billion in 2021 for the creation of this new emergency housing voucher program that targeted housing vouchers to people experiencing or at immediate risk of homelessness or housing instability and survivors of intimate partner violence and human trafficking. The program has been wildly successful and still helps about 60,000 households afford the cost of rent. However, because the cost of rent has increased so drastically over the last 5 years, funding is projected to run out for this program midway through 2026 or sooner for some agencies. And so we are calling on Congress to provide funding to preserve these important vouchers or to fold EHV households into the Housing Choice Voucher program to ensure essentially that no one loses the assistance that they rely on to keep a roof over their heads. So looking ahead, right now, members of Congress are back in their home states and districts for the month of August, which is known as August recess. August is a great time to meet with your members to show them the important work that your communities are doing with HUD funding, to show them the continued need in your communities as well. Congress will be back in session on September 2nd, and they will have again until October 1st to enact their FY26 spending bills or a continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded. Then I just have a little side note here on Hill lingo that some folks tend to throw around, and I know that I do sometimes. But just as like a little aside to save time, Congress sometimes votes on multiple spending bills all at once, and that's called a minibus or a minibus spending package. And if they are voting on all 12 appropriation bills in one huge package, it's referred to as an omnibus spending bill or an omnibus spending package. So what happens next? Unfortunately, I don't quite know. We'll see. If I had to guess though, it's likely that we're going to end up in a series of continuing resolutions and potentially another long-term continuing resolution or another year-long CR. And under another year-long CR, HUD homelessness and rental assistance programs would need, again, that additional funding, that anomaly funding in order to maintain critical services. So we are going to be paying attention to how the appropriations process is unfolding to make sure that we get sufficient funding regardless of what the future holds. And then I just have some resources. We have a toolkit for FY26 that has advocacy ideas and talking points, as well as additional information. We have take action pages to help people contact their members of Congress, as well as storytelling tips and tricks to help folks tell their personal stories and connect it to research and help communicate with their members of Congress on the importance of continuing funding for many of these programs. And we have a Reject Housing Cuts and EHV Funding Cliff Toolkit from NLIHC and our partners at the Center on Budget, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the National Housing Law Project. So I'm going to stop talking and stop screen sharing so that we can get to your questions.
Thank you, Kim. And I appreciate the GIF too that says, I don't know, because I think that's all of us right now. Okay, let me see. I have a few questions that came up during the call. I think the first one came from Holly, just regarding the housing funding. I think she just wanted to see if we could make the housing appropriations information shareable for her advisory board. Is that correct, Holly, or did I misread that? I don't know if Holly's still on, but yeah, if there's any shareable information, I think we can share that with you afterwards. But if there's something in particular that you're looking for, we can try to dig it up and share it with you afterwards. Okay, Juan Pablo asked, how do all of these cuts align / overlap with the changes that have already happened through Doge? So for example, isn't the USICH not already or not functioning already?
Yeah, so great questions. Um, where is USICH right now? That is a great question. So USICH was targeted for closure. I don't think they ultimately have been successful in shutting it down quite yet. But I do think, Juan Pablo, you make a really important point in that a lot of what we were seeing in kind of the House budget is meant to reinforce some of what the White House has already done to kind of destroy the existing infrastructure in the federal government. So like, like zeroing out funding for USICH, even though, the Trump administration is already targeting it for closure. It's kind of like a way of them essentially walking hand in hand and showing that they support the president in his endeavors.
Thank you.
And I was just thinking about too, because I think Juan Pablo also brings up a really interesting and important point too about kind of the intersection of all the things that are going on right now, right? Because so we're seeing this like HUD budget proposal come out of I mean the House one is pretty bad. And the disastrous one from the Trump administration, but we're also looking at the impact that communities are going to start feeling from the cuts that have been enacted to SNAP and Medicaid through the Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so it's this kind of pattern of slashing federal funding and then putting responsibility on states to try to fill in that gap over and over again, program after program. And so how many communities actually have the funding that they would need to fill in all of these gaps that are forming? None. Because only that's literally the role of the federal government. And so, we're seeing this kind of continuation of like coming after these various programs and cutting them and destroying them in these different ways, and this kind of longer term and like compounding effect that it's going to have on state and local communities and their budgets too.
Thanks, Kim. So there's one more question that I'll take from the chat and then I'll go to, is it Calpurnia? You're on deck.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Awesome. Great, you're on deck. But the next question that we got from the chat was from Emily asking, will disabled individuals be limited in how long they can live in HUD housing?
Yeah, so that is a great question, Emily. So we saw in the president's budget request a proposal around 2-year time limits in HUD housing. That didn't come through in the House or the Senate budget, which is good. The House budget does have some kind of sneaky, tricky language that would essentially allow public housing authorities the ability to, or the flexibility to implement time limits or work requirements if they wanted to. You know what I mean? So it stops short of like actually full-throatedly saying, oh yes, and we're going to implement these, but like, oh, you could if you wanted, which we also, of course, object to and fully reject. So the question around, would this apply to people with disabilities and, to wrap in older adults too, to that kind of category, they say no that, people with disabilities, the older adults, the quote unquote truly needy will not be impacted by these cuts. But I think everybody on this call knows that people don't live these kind of like siloed or discretioned lives where it's like, yes, you definitely fall into the category of disability, or yes, you absolutely fall into the category of, deservingly able-bodied or something like that. You know what I mean? So all that is to say, they say that they're going to try to put up guardrails to prevent people with disabilities or older adults from being kicked out of these programs. But we've seen time and again from the implementation of barriers like this on other programs that that is never how it works. That people get kicked out of the programs that they rely on because the reporting requirements are confusing, because they didn't do it right, because they didn't have internet access, because of a million different reasons, because you forgot, because what people have busy lives, to report back on, how many hours you worked or volunteered in the last, month. So we know that even as they say they're going to try to make sure that this is implemented in such a way that people are kept safe, we know from experience that that is never really how it pans out.
Yep. Well, fingers crossed that we get a good version that comes out, but only the future will tell. I think we've been really good at advocating and pushing, and I think we got some good people, very passionate people on this call that can help out with that too. Calpurnia, if you want to ask your question.
Thank you. I was just curious, has it ever happened where the continuing resolution just kept, like, it's occurring until the following year when the president has to begin the next fiscal budget?
Yep.
And then what happens? Do you even bother with the FY26 appropriations bill, or I don't know?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So that is technically what happened this past year. This past year was a whole mess. So basically, the budget was due October 1st. They did not manage to pass it. They didn't manage to pass a full FY25 budget. They ended up doing a full year continuing resolution. So they took the FY24 budget and said, copy paste, and said, this is FY25 now. They provided some additional funding for certain programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program to try to help with the cost of renewals. But I'm trying to remember the timeline. So they finished that FY25 budget, the full year continuing resolution, in March. And the president's budget, I believe, came out in late April. So usually that's kind of what we see. We see the end of one fiscal year before the president releases a new budget. This year they were very kind of close together because the president's budget was bananas anyway, so it didn't really matter what Congress was going to do. The president was going to ask to cut everything regardless. We did see another situation like that. I think it might have been FY24, actually, where it took Congress so long for them to pass a final budget that the White House had already begun drafting their budget for the next fiscal year. And so the final fiscal year budget came out, and then the president's budget came out, and it was like, it was bad. It wasn't very good because he didn't have the final numbers from the previous fiscal year to work off of. So it was like these kind of very paltry numbers that we saw come out of the White House because they didn't have the final bill to kind of base their numbers off of. So yes, we see silly nonsense like that all of the time. Sometimes I joke with my boss that if I, can I just turn this in 5 months late like Congress? She says
That's
no.
funny. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We have 2 more questions I think that I saw in the chat, so I think that might be all we have time for, but we'll see. So the first one was, how soon could the worst case scenario happen with the funding?
Ooh, So I guess the next big date that we're really paying attention to is October 1st, because that's when they're going to need to have either their next budget in place, or they're going to need to pass a continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded. If they don't have either of those, we're going to be in a partial federal government shutdown, which in the short term, well, is not good, obviously. In the short term, isn't terrible for HUD programs and is not dangerous for HUD tenants, so I don't want folks to worry. But in the long term can be dangerous for HUD tenants in ensuring that their rent is paid on time and all of the other important functions that HUD helps provide. So October 1st is really kind of the next big deadline that we're looking at for something to happen. As far as kind of the bigger picture of like when will we have a final budget, really, it remains to be seen, unfortunately. I wish I knew.
The last question that I saw was, are they still closing field offices?
Good question. From what I have heard, and the word on the street is that the cuts at HUD offices have stopped. Essentially that they have realized, oh no, you need people in offices to carry out these essential functions of HUD programs. Who knew? If only people had been screaming that at them since day one. But essentially, they have reached a point of one, cutting so many staff have left that they are already struggling to get stuff out the door and do all of the kind of essential functionings. And a lot of the HUD staff took what I'm sure folks remember being referred to as the fork in the road offer, that said essentially, hey, you can either take this buyout or you can stay on in your job and potentially be fired later. So many people took that buyout that HUD apparently does not have the money to actually pay all of them out for leaving. It's almost like that did not make sense from the jump and was a very silly idea. But yes, so all of that is to say, we do think so far that what the latest word is on HUD staffing cuts is that the staffing cuts have subsided, and we're going to start to see kind of dust settle and see where things are now.
Thank you, Kim. And I think we have time for just one more before we wrap up, but I just lost it. Okay, so Calpurnia just asked, what can we do if we live in a very blue state to convince legislatures to fund HUD and provide rental assistance supports?
Yeah, so that is a great question. I found that even in very blue states, a lot of the time, elected officials don't necessarily understand the affordable housing crisis and how it's connected to, homelessness and how it's impacting their lower income constituents too. So even as they kind of, I see this with Ron Wyden, who's up in Oregon, even as he, understands a lot of these really complex housing issues and is such a champion and advocate for certain things, he also wants to enact certain policies like the middle income housing tax credit that we think of as kind of a waste of money to like give scarce federal funding to developers to build housing that they're going to build anyway. And so, having those conversations, even when it's like, oh, I'm pretty sure you agree with me on this, but like having those conversations and those check-ins to make sure that they're really keeping in mind the needs of constituents with the lowest incomes, the needs of renters, because often, even with the kind of, most like progressive minded elected officials, they can sometimes forget that still. So I think it's always important to still show up, and to still, and if they are doing a great job, say thank you. That also is always, always forget that sometimes they do a good job and you can say thank you. So, if they're doing a good job, by all means.
And that's also my cue to say thank you to you, Kim, for joining us and
My
sharing
pleasure.
that wisdom. You're getting a lot of kudos in the chat too.
Of course, happy to join. Thank you all so much. I'll leave my email in the chat in case folks want to reach out. But again, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kim. Yeah, and if y'all have any questions or anything that you all want to provide feedback for, feel free to reach out to me at my email, which I'll drop in the chat as well. And thank you everybody for joining and being lively in the chat. I always like catching up with y'all there as well. Our next Tenant Talk Live will be I didn't update the script with the right number, but our next our next Tenant Talk Live will be on September 8th because Labor Day falls on September 1st. So just make sure you note that it'll be on September 8th. And I'll drop the registration link in the chat for you all. And then for folks who are new or this is like your first time, we also have a blog called On the Home Front, where we feature stories from advocates about like their lived experience and stuff, or anything else that you want to talk about, any advocacy you have going on. And if you want to learn more about that, I'll also drop the email in the chat for you all to reach out to to be engaged with that. And then we stay connected on our Facebook group. So everybody, well, not everybody, but most folks who like to stay engaged will be on there. And I'll drop that link in the chat as well for you all. And then, yeah, I'll make sure to include like the links that were shared by other folks as well in the chat, in our recap email. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on September. Have a good night, everybody.